In this video, you'll see why poetry gets a bad rap and why it ultimately doesn't matter. And you'll finally know that thing your English teacher never told you, that thing everyone in class was always wondering about. Why the heck should we care about poetry? So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. What's up, friends? Welcome to Literally Everyone, where we make literature our life and our life into literature. My name is Igor Nobla, and I'm a Venezuelan-American writer. This is day 2 of our 30-day poetry course. If you're just tuning in, make sure to check out my intro video to the channel and this series, which is linked in the description. Now, in order to see why poetry matters, we have to break apart all the reasons why people don't engage with it. We're going to start with a quote from a Medium article titled, "Why I Hate Poetry." I enthusiastically believe that poetry is a waste of time. I understand why some people write poetry and enjoy reading poetry, but students shouldn't be forced to overanalyze and overinterpret such irrelevant and confusing pieces of writing to write 1,000-word essays on. Okay, so this fella is clearly not on the fence. It's clear he dislikes poetry, and for obvious reasons. Some of the most common complaints of poetry are that it is confusing and irrelevant, as well as that students are forced to overanalyze and overinterpret it. So let's see what else he has to say. Poetry is the same as art. Take abstract art, for example, where an artist just grabs a brush of paint and starts spraying it everywhere. Poetry is the same, where one can grab random words from a dictionary to create the effect of some deeper meaning. In interpreting a poem like an abstract painting, we can come to see things or have a false understanding of things that aren't necessarily there. In this quote, this author compares poetry to abstract art, which I think is actually a pretty good comparison. He doesn't know it yet, but he'd be a good poet. Now, in all honesty, I think these are very valid. But I think the issue about abstract art comes from a lack of understanding what art, or at least art in the last 100 years, is all about. Traditionally, artists attempted to capture reality or depict scenes from popular stories and myths. However, in the early 20th century, the social-cultural landscape of the world changed so much that the artists were forced to change the way they understood and used art. Some, like the Dadaist and the Surrealist, moved away from reality when faced with the horrors of war and depression. Others later on tried to use art to understand and explore and communicate ideas, since so much of the 1900s was full of discovery. So we got abstract art forms and expressions and cubism. This turned the artist from an entertainer to an academic or an activist. This was excellent for the complexities of the modern world, but much of art, including literature, then moved to the academies rather than staying in the public spheres. But more on that later. Now, the final argument this writer makes hits on some of these issues. Poems are just songs that you aren't meant to sing. A song that's only recognized by the minority, the English community. Poetry doesn't belong in classrooms, and the study of poems should be confined to the people who get turned on by poems and wish to lay by them in bed. English classes should be restricted to writing essays and analyzing real pieces of writing or work. Poetry is like regular writing, but with so many more rules and regulations that it becomes less a piece of writing and more a random number generator confined to the number 1. And whoops, there it is. He says poetry is meant to be understood by the minority, the English community, which I take to mean teachers and professors. What I don't understand is the part about essays being real writing. As an essayist, I would say that essays are the easiest form of writing to grasp. And although there are many essays that have changed my life and many that have changed the world, like the Declaration of Independence, stories and poems are by far more difficult to write and far more impactful, which I would consider as qualities of real writing. You see, essays are concrete. For the most part, they don't hide much, but speak, even when artistically, in easily digestible forms. Compare that to a novel or a poem, which are both filled with allusions and metaphors, subtleties, wordplay, characterization to speak of some aspect of our lives. People devote weeks in book clubs discussing characters and events in novels, and they share and enjoy poems that are older than most modern inventions today, like the Bible, the Iliad, the Divine Comedy. How many essays do you know off the top of your head that have that level of durability and influence? Another part that is off from this last quote is that this fellow describes poems like regular writing, but with so many more rules and regulations. Sure, but I think Sunny Side Up just doesn't quite understand what writing is. You see, all writing has rules and regulations, more than we'd care to realize. Speech, which is the most natural form of communication for humans, is full of rules. Each language has its own grammatical constructions, semantics, social etiquette imbued within it. That all translates to writing, which came much later and was designed to help people remember information. Because writing is closely tied to some mechanical function, some purpose, like bookkeeping. Certain rules were designed to keep it uniform and practical. Punctuation marks, capitalization, paragraphing, and the deeper we go into different kinds of writing, the more rules we see. The traditional 5-paragraph essay that we often see in school, for example, has rules about how to start, how to write a thesis, how to organize each of its paragraphs, how to close, what to include in the introduction and conclusion, how to organize more paragraphs and avoid and include certain aspects of the writing, what kinds of words to use and to avoid. The more we delve into writing, the more rules we discover. I think the issue is that because poetry is so short, we can see all those rules more clearly than in a 1,000-word essay, for example. Now, some of these guys' other points may seem valid, but underneath they have the same problem. His argument about poetry being random and having non-existent deeper meanings is very subjective. Perhaps some poems are random, but who's to say whether the poet created them with a deeper meaning in mind or not? We can't, unless we analyze them to see. But perhaps this is too cheesy of me to say, but I think all things have deeper meanings because we create those meanings when we attach our experiences. Think about the last time a movie or a TV show felt personal. The last time someone said, "This is my jam." Is it really your jam? The last time we were moved by a sermon, a speech, or a ceremony. These things don't always have inherent deeper meanings, but we give them one as an audience because we as human beings are always seeking to find and give meanings to things. If things don't have meanings, then we find them pointless. It's the classical existential issue. Real quick, if you're finding content useful, please hit like and subscribe so it can reach others who might find it useful, and you can keep up with all the different videos that we're gonna have in this show. Now let's get back to the discussion. Okay, so I will say that his claim about poetry being for the academics only, or for the English committee, is one that I've actually had as well. Modern poetry, as I've mentioned, evolved perhaps out of necessity to be tied to the universities, to the academy, to social critique and research. This is why all serious poetry done today, the one that receives the awards and gets the book deals, is for professors teaching creative writing classes. There's nothing wrong with that until you realize that as a tight-knit group, a community, there is a lot of gatekeeping. Even journals that publish poetry tell you on their submissions that publishing is very subjective. Whether a piece gets published or not depends on who the editor reading it is and whether they connect with it or not. And since these are usually university faculty, former faculty, or graduate students seeking to be faculty, their often traditionalist tastes determine what poetry gets submitted and what makes the page. This is one of the reasons why I've started this YouTube channel and why I'm doing this poetry course, to help regular people realize that no one owns poetry, or any kind of literature for that matter, that you can read and write poetry without feeling like you're not qualified to do so. Literally everyone can lit. Now, even more so, poetry should not be excluded from English classrooms. That's quite silly. Poetry is a part of all languages. It only makes sense that it should be studied in a class that revolves around exploring the English language. Furthermore, it is incredibly useful for teaching. Reading poetry is the ultimate intensive form. It teaches us not only to pay attention to language, but to pay attention to the subtleties in life. I had a colleague as a teacher that used poetry to teach her students to read. It was because of her that I started using poetry in my own classroom to teach non-native English speakers to read and write in English. You'd think that the English in poetry would be too difficult for non-English speakers to decipher, but it was just from a month of doing this that I got one of my slowest learners in the class to make comments like, Maybe the poem is saying we should use the power that we have with caution because it could lead us astray. If a student who doesn't speak English could decipher this deep of a meaning from a children's poem about a teacher that didn't wear glasses, then maybe we should be using poetry instead of novels and essays in grade school language arts. Okay, so everyone has the right to like or dislike what they want, but without being too critical, let me just point to the most confused remarks in this gentleman's article, where he points out, if you search on Google why poetry is bad, the number of relevant articles that come up are but a mere fraction of those that come up for why poetry is good. Okay, maybe there's a good reason why that is. And if you want to know the answer to that last question, check out day 1 of this 30-day poetry course on the benefits of poetry. Now don't get me wrong, poetry is difficult, but it doesn't have to be. And so are a lot of things in life. Just because they are doesn't mean they're not worth our time. On that note, let me mention this amazing article written by Reginald Shepard on the difficulty of poetry. Here Shepard makes this reassuring remark. I don't believe that the average person doesn't want to be challenged and stimulated. There is, for example, a whole industry of verbal challenges, from crossword puzzles to Scrabbles, that the so-called general public relishes. Just as mystery can be a part of a person's allure, so mystery and poetry can be allure. Yeats called this the fascination of what's difficult. Shepard also quoted T.S. Eliot, who wrote that genuine poetry can communicate before it's understood, and adds a real work of art makes us stop and pay attention. It breaks through a crust of habit and routine. Shepard is, to my assessment, part of that English committee our first writer mentioned. So clearly he will write perhaps too positively in favor of poetry, perhaps ignoring the fact that not everyone has the energy or the mind to break apart Milton after working all day and coming home to cook and clean and put down the kids. But he has a point. It is this routine that can be exhausting. It is here where poetry can shine, brief but powerful. It is here where we can remember that we don't have to understand the poem to understand what it is saying. Poems are experiences, first and foremost. There should be no shame, though our history with school might say otherwise, about interpreting poetry. If we don't get it, it's fine. It will all be okay. Even poets don't understand all poetry. Some of my favorite poems I didn't understand until much later, when my relationship with them and myself had evolved. It has been said that a poem contains the truth disguised as a lie. In that case, a quote I once heard rings so much louder. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. This is where our initial quote comes in. How do poems grow? They grow out of life. Perhaps poems are too difficult to understand because life is too difficult to understand. Perhaps we feel before we understand because in life we feel first, and then, only in time and with determination and help, do we understand and grow. This is why we study poetry, and this is why it doesn't matter how difficult or how inaccessible or how out of place poetry might make us feel at first. We should read it, we should enjoy it, and if we've got the energy and time, analyze it. Because it's not about the rules or the words or the techniques, but the process of discovering and enjoying the unknown here in these pages where it is safe before we come face to face with the real unknowns in our lives. So if you want to break from the routine, slow down, pay attention, and feel something genuine, pick up a book of poetry and listen. And click subscribe so you can stick around for the next episode in this series, which will explain what exactly is a poem and how you can spot it out in the wild. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, words like food nourish. See you next time.